And we're live.
Great. Thank you all for coming.
You're welcome.
Today, I will be talking about political philosophy. This is awesome. And I'll be talking about John Rawls, who is this guy right here. This book is John Rawls.
That guy.
It's not a picture of him, it is a blue. John Rawls is a contemporary political philosopher. He is born in probably the 30s. He just recently died about 5 years ago. And he wrote this thing, which is a theory of justice, in 1971. And the reason it's important is that it revolutionized contemporary political philosophy. Before that, people were having trouble coming to people were having trouble creating sort of moral justification for a lot of liberal egalitarian principles, creating a widely accepted sort of moral framework for justice in society. And Rawls created this, and everything since then has pretty much been a response to Rawls, which is why he's important. So I'm just going to basically run through his argument, try to keep it very basic so that people who haven't heard of him before at all will still be able to understand, and sort of explain what he says and sort of why it makes sense. So, Rawls is big on justice. He's trying to figure out, he's trying to figure out how we can set up a society in the best way that is fair and is just for everybody. And he comes up with something he calls the 2 principles of justice. The first principle is basic freedoms for everybody. We should set up a society in which everybody has basic freedoms. So, freedom of speech, freedom of political participation, freedom to to move around, basic freedoms that pretty hard to argue against. And that's sort of the first and most important principle, that everybody in society should have those freedoms. The second principle is more complicated, and that's the difference principle. The difference principle essentially states that there can be inequality in a society so long as it makes the worst person better off. So it's also called the maxi-min principle, in that you can disregard, if everything were equal, if we were purely egalitarian, we wanted to make everybody equal in all aspects, we would say somebody can't make more money than somebody else because that would be unequal. But Rawls is saying somebody can make more money than somebody else, or have more property, or have something else, so long as the person who's worse off in society is made better off by it. So, for example, if somebody invents a new thing that makes them a lot of money, and people are willing to pay for it, but that invention makes the people who are worse in society better off, that inequality resulting from the invention should be allowed, because everybody is better off, or the worst off in society are better off, even though there's now inequality. So that's the difference principle. Off the top, just on the surface, it sort of intuitively makes sense, but Rawls comes up with a very interesting argument to defend this position and to show why it's fair and why people in a society would choose these principles and should choose these principles. He creates a thought experiment called the original position, in which it's a hypothetical construct in which if there were representatives of people in a society who were behind a veil of ignorance, the veil of ignorance being they don't know where in society they'll end up or what they'll naturally be endowed with. So for example, you don't know if you're going to end up with a lot of money, you're going to end up with a little bit of money, you don't know if you're going to be really smart, or if you're going to be really stupid. If you didn't know these things behind a veil of ignorance, but you did know that you're sort of rationally trying to do the best for yourself, you would choose these 2 principles. The way to think about this is the cutting the cake analogy. You've got 2 people, and you've got a cake, or a pie, doesn't matter. One person gets to cut the pie, and the other person gets to choose the first slice, right? So if you're in that position, and you're cutting the pie or cake, you will probably choose an equal distribution so that you don't get screwed over. Because if you cut it 90% and 10%, assuming everybody wants more pie, which if it's cake, we can agree they do, then you'll get the 10% and that'll be worse off. The only way you can guarantee yourself being best off is by cutting it equally. And so the original position is a hypothetical construct, but it doesn't have to exist in society for it to make sense. It's just to show what is fair for our society that does exist. So from that original position, oh, and one more thing about the cake, but if you have the option of having a bigger cake or pie, then even if you cut it not necessarily equally, you might still end up with more than you would first time around. So that's the intuition behind both Maximin and why people would choose the two principles of justice in the original position. They would choose the first principle, obviously, because if you don't know where you're going to end up in society, you probably want to make sure that you have freedom of speech, freedom of political participation, basic freedoms. Everybody's going to want that in society. That sort of makes sense. You're not going to choose society in which you might end up getting screwed up. So some people like to think of it as being risk averse. People are not going to choose a situation in which they could end up getting screwed up. And therefore, as such, the fair distribution is one that sort of is the two principles of justice, follows the two principles of justice. And that's the basic gist of John Rawls' argument. That makes sense.